Alrighty, let's dive into the grim yet fascinating world of Victorian era hangings with a bit of a casual twist. Imagine a time when Netflix wasn't around and people needed some form of entertainment. Gruesome as it may sound, public hangings were kind of like the morbid blockbusters of the Victorian era. Now, hanging wasn't just a drop in the park, it was a go-to showstopper for very serious crimes. Think of it as the ultimate deterrent, a stark warning that crime doesn't pay, especially not in an era where stealing a loaf of bread could land you in a world of trouble. It went a little something like this. A town crier announces the upcoming execution. I would love to be a town crier. Oh my god. Those guys had all the tea. Just going and yelling at everybody. Oh I really wanted to do a town crier impersonation, but I just can't yell in here. Chris's ears would explode. A town crier announces the upcoming execution. Flyers are posted and word spreads like wildfire. On the big day, people flock from far and wide, creating a carnival-like atmosphere. There are vendors selling snacks, folks jostling for the best view, and an air of anticipation that's hard to miss. The condemned, often paraded through the streets, would then face their final curtain on the gallows, a platform designed for the very purpose of ending lives. The executioner, sometimes hooded, would place the rope around the prisoner's neck, a process watched with bated breath by the crowd. A quick pull of the lever and it was all over. But here's a twist in the tale. Public executions weren't just about punishment, they were also seen as moral lessons. Live action morality plays meant to instill fear and promote good behavior. Yet, the spectacle sometimes backfired. Sympathies occasionally swayed towards the unfortunate soul on the gallows, especially if the crowd deemed their crime petty or their behavior sympathetic. By 1868, Britain decided this was all a bit too much for public sensibilities and moved executions behind the solemn walls of prisons, away from the public's prying eyes and picnics. So next time you're queuing for the latest movie or binge watching a series, spare a thought for the Victorians, for whom a day out might have just involved a bit of gallows theater, complete with real life drama, tragedy, and unfortunately no encore for the star of the show. Ooh. Alright, next up on our list we have flogging. Spare the rod and spoil the child. If you've heard this phrase before, imagine it being taken to the extreme, as they often did in the Victorian era. Flogging wasn't just a quick slap on the wrist, it was a full-on event with the person typically tied up and given a set number of lashes that could leave scars for life. This punishment wasn't exclusive to hardened criminals. Oh no, even some of the more vulnerable members of our communities could get a taste of the whip for acting up. And soldiers or sailors might find themselves on the receiving end for stepping out of line. The idea was that a good thrashing could correct any number of moral or disciplinary issues. Sounds pretty harsh, right? Well, that was Victorian justice for you. Very much about making the punishment fit the crime with a side of public humiliation to ensure you'd think twice before stepping out of line again. Next up on our list today we have the debtor's prison. Imagine a world where you've just run out of luck with your finances and bam, you're sent off to a debtor's prison, which is about as fun as it sounds. So, not fun at all. These places were grim. Think of the worst hotel you've ever seen, then remove any windows, heating, or good food. In debtor's prison, you were stuck until your debt was paid off, but here's where things get even more interesting. How in the world are you supposed to settle your debts when you're locked up and you can't work? It's kind of like trying to run a marathon with your legs tied together. Meanwhile, your family on the outside, yeah, forgot about them, they're just scrambling to get by without their main money earner, which often plunged them into their own financial crisis. Love that. It was just a vicious cycle that didn't do much for actually solving the problem of debt. Instead, it just added a hefty dose of misery and despair to the mix. It sounds like the Victorian era was actually just a lot of that. Misery and despair. So next time you're fretting about paying bills, just be thankful you're not doing it Victorian style, I guess. Or else I'd be in Rogers prison for my phone bill. Next up we have the scold's bridle. Back in the Victorian era, if a woman was labeled a bit too chatty or opinionated, heaven forbid she actually nag, she might find herself in the not so stylish accessory known as the scold's bridle. Imagine a heavy, clunky metal mask clamping over your head, complete with a gag right in your mouth to put the kibosh on any further chit-chat. Okay, not exactly the pinnacle of fashion or comfort, right? This contraption wasn't just about silencing, it was the 19th century version of public shaming with a generous dash of misogyny. Women were paraded around, their speech literally bridled as a warning to others that speaking out of turn wasn't just frowned upon, it was punishable. Thankfully, we've relegated such barbaric practices to the history books, but the scold's bridle remains a stark reminder of how far we've come in understanding and respecting individual rights and voices. Moving on down our list, we are talking about transportation next. Imagine you're living in 19th century Britain and things are frankly pretty bleak if you're not wearing a top hat and tails. Now imagine you've been caught stealing a loaf of bread or, heaven forbid, a handkerchief. The punishment? Well, you're not just going to the local jail, you're being shipped off to the other side of the world. Transportation meant being packed off to Australia or Tasmania, places that were as remote and alien as the moon for many Brits at the time. These were no pleasure cruises. The journey alone could take months on cramped, disease-ridden ships where survival was a coin toss. Once you arrived, if you were still kicking, congratulations! Your prize was hard labor in brutal conditions, often in chain gangs or remote outposts where the sun seemed to have a personal vendetta against you. And forget about a leisurely pint at the pub, you were there to work, building the infrastructure for new colonies, often in sweltering heat or other extreme conditions. Starting off today, we are diving into the world of mental asylums. Mental asylums during the Victorian era are definitely not your modern day rehab center. These places were like the catch-all bucket for anyone society didn't quite know how to handle, not just for those grappling with mental illness, but also for people who just didn't fit the very tight Victorian mold. Got a rebellious streak or just too loud for your neighbor's liking? You might just find yourself locked up in one of these gloomy asylums. And let me tell you, the conditions were nothing short of nightmarish. We're talking about overcrowding, minimal if any real mental health treatment, and methods of confinement that could make even the sanest person question their sanity. It was less about healing and more about hiding away the problematic ones out of society's sight. Imagine being treated more like a prisoner in a dungeon than a patient in a hospital. That was the harsh reality of Victorian mental asylums. Next up on our list today, we have peine forte et dure. Imagine being accused of a crime in the not so good old days, and there you are, stubbornly refusing to plead guilty or not guilty because you know the system is rigged. Enter the nightmare fuel of the medieval world. This gruesome punishment method was something straight out of a horror flick. The accused would be laid flat and a board would be placed on top of their chest. Then stones, cold, heavy stones, are piled onto the board one by one. The weight increases, the breathing gets harder, and why endure such torture? It's all because of a loophole. By not pleading guilty or not guilty, the accused could avoid a formal trial, which meant even if they died under the weight, their family could still inherit their stuff. It was a brutal, desperate gamble. Though officially scrapped just before the Victorian era kicked in, the sheer horror of this punishment lingered in the public memory, kind of like the ghost of punishments past whispering, "Be glad you live in the now." Next up, we are journeying over to the gibbet. The gibbet, or gibbeting, was like a horror movie of old school punishments. So picture this. After the execution took place, the criminal wasn't just buried and forgotten about. Nope, that would just be too easy, I guess. Their body instead was sometimes locked up in an iron cage and hung from a tall frame called a gibbet, kind of like a creepy bird cage, but for humans. This wasn't tucked away in some dark corner either, it was of course out in the open where everyone could see it. The body was left to hang there, decomposing in the open air, come rain or shine. Why the public display? Well, it was all about scare tactics. The sight of a swinging, decaying corpse was supposed to frighten anyone from thinking about breaking the law. Fair enough. It was a very stark, gruesome reminder plastered right in the town square. Break the law and you could be the next ghastly attraction. Yikes. Talk about a deterrent. I don't think I'd commit any crime after that, actually. It's crazy. Even just like Scared Straight or whatever that show is, like that was enough for me. Just a real dead body hanging in the middle of the town square. So scary. Okay. I don't think I'd do well in the Victorian era, but I guess they wouldn't do well now. Imagine showing like TikTok to a Victorian child. Next up on our list today, we are talking about hulks. Before dedicated prisons became widespread, hulks were a common form of punishment. At first, hulks sounds more like something from like a pirate adventure than real life, but trust me, it was far from a swashbuckling good time. Before the days of modern prisons, these old creaky warships, stripped of their glory and no longer seaworthy, were anchored permanently in harbors to house prisoners. Imagine being crammed into the dank, dark belly of a decommissioned ship with scores of other unfortunate souls. Conditions on these floating prisons were nothing short of nightmarish. They were overcrowded, they were festering with disease, and the air was thick with despair. Prisoners were often put to back-breaking work during the day, maybe hammering away at shipbreaking or toiling in nearby docks or riverbanks, and life on a hull was just a grim, a slow, and a steady descent into misery, making it one of the punishments from the past that was as much about enduring harsh conditions as it was about serving time. Next up on our list today, we have shame. Public humiliation was a go-to tactic in the punishment playbook during the Victorian era, and honestly even before that. Imagine being caught for a petty theft or a public nuisance, and instead of just serving time or getting a ticket, you're slapped with a giant sign spelling out your crime, and then you are paraded around town. Or perhaps you'll find yourself locked in the stocks, stuck in one uncomfortable position in the town square. Here, everyone from cheeky kids to stern old-timers could get a good look at you, and they didn't just stare. Oh, of course not. They jeered, they tossed rotten tomatoes, or worse, sometimes. It wasn't just about making you rethink your life choices, it was about showing everyone else what could happen if they stepped out of line. This kind of punishment turned lawbreakers into live lessons in morality, with a side of entertainment Victorian style. Kinda makes you glad that all you get is a parking ticket these days, right? I'm just saying, alright? Put that in the gratitude journal this morning. Next up on our list today, we have the drunkard's cloak. Speaking of shame, this was one method that definitely worked to embarrass anyone out of committing this crime, and it also showed that maybe the Victorians had a bit of a sense of humor, although a very morbid one. So imagine you're in a bustling town square and there's someone looking quite ridiculous and moving awkwardly among the crowd. This poor soul is decked out in the infamous drunkard's cloak, which is basically a barrel turned into a heavy, uncomfortable garment. Think of it as the original cone of shame, but for humans. This barrel, often with holes for the arms and head, turned public drunks into walking spectacles. Walking around in this bulky, clunky barrel made any movement a challenge and attracted all kinds of stares, snickers, and maybe even a few rotten tomatoes from onlookers. This cloak wasn't just a punishment, it was a public statement. I partied too hard, and look where it got me. Designed to shame the wearer and entertain the public, the drunkard's cloak was a bizarre blend of punishment and street theater. So next time you're thinking about overdoing it at happy hour, just be thankful you're not doing so in a time when the hangover could involve navigating the local market in a barrel. That would be horrible. Next up on our list, we have the silent system. Imagine stepping into a Victorian era prison and hearing absolutely nothing. That would be so creepy, right? And that is the silent system for you. Introduced as a shiny new way to keep prisoners from corrupting each other with their criminal chatter, this system took solitary confinement up a notch. Inmates were not only isolated, but were also required to remain completely silent. The idea was that the silence would help them reflect on their crimes and reform. Sounds Noble in theory maybe, but in practice it was a lot more like psychological torture. The utter lack of conversation, the inability to express any thoughts or feelings often drove prisoners to the brink of madness. This eerie quiet was intended to cleanse their moral palate, but instead it often led to severe mental breakdowns. Talk about a punishment that leaves you speechless, literally and figuratively.
Number 5. Solitary confinement. You're grounded. And I really mean you're grounded. In the Victorian era, solitary confinement was a widely utilized form of punishment that embodied the period's harsh philosophy. Yeah, we're not cranking things. This time we're just thinking about our problems. It was known originally as the separate system, and it was designed to isolate prisoners to reflect on their crimes and ideally reform. Rather, they just went absolutely insane. Inmates were confined in small, stark cells, cut off from all human contact and external stimuli. No sunlight, no hope, nothing. The silence and isolation were intended to prevent the corruption associated with the prisoner interaction, and of course encourage penitence, right? You wanna behave, of course. However, this extreme isolation often led to severe psychological effects, if anything, including mental breakdowns. I'd have a breakdown on day 2, are you kidding me? I thought getting grounded as a kid was bad, but at least then I could see the sun, so not half bad considering what it used to be. Number 4, branding. Now we're cooking. Branding was a brutal form of punishment often reserved for criminals convicted of the gravest offenses. I mean, obviously, you're getting your ass. I would assume it's pretty bad. This punitive practice involved searing the skin of the convicted individual with a hot iron, typically marking them with a letter symbolizing their crime. So for instance, T for thief or M for murder. Performed publicly or within prison walls, branding was not only excruciatingly painful, but also served as a lifelong stigma because, well, that's not going anywhere. That's going to be there for life. It would permanently mark individuals as criminals and ostracize them from society. By the mid-19th century, this barbaric practice was thankfully phased out. Imagine if Victorians could see the movie Jackass 2. I wonder what they'd think of Bam Margera getting paid to be branded. Oh, how the times have changed, my God. Number 3, public whipping. Public whipping was sadly a common measure in the Victorian era. It was a harsh and humiliating form of punishment. It was administered with a whip or, if you were really bad, a cat o' nine tails, which was a multi-tailed whip that inflicted severe pain. This punishment was often carried out in public squares to serve as a deterrent to others. Ideally, you'd look at them and go, wow, that's horrible. I'm never gonna steal bread. Let's go home. And then Bob's your uncle. The convicted person was typically tied to a whipping post, stripped to the waist, and then lashed a specific number of times, depending on the severity of said crime. The physical scars were complemented by the stigma of having been punished in full view of the community. Over time, as societal attitudes towards corporal punishment shifted, thankfully public whipping was increasingly seen as barbaric and was largely abolished by the end of the 19th century. Number 2, the pillory and stocks. The pillory and stocks were prominent tools of public humiliation and shame. The pillory involved securing a person's head and hands in a wooden frame. You've probably seen this in any medieval times or whatever. They were usually elevated while stocks immobilized the offender's feet and sometimes their hand at ground level. Quite uncomfortable. Positioned in public squares, obviously, these devices exposed individuals to the ridicule and abuse of passerbyers who often hurled rotten food, mud, and verbal insults at you while you were just stuck there watching the whole thing. POV. Utilized for crimes such as petty theft, slander, and disorderly conduct, these punishments aimed not to only deter the offender, but also serve as a stark warning to the community, as they're hucking mud pies at you, I guess. This one would suck. Everyone waits until your hands are locked up, and now they want to tell you how they feel. What a horrible time. I'd keep track of who's doing it and be like, okay, I'm coming back for you, sir. Number 1, hanging. During the Victorian era, hanging was the ultimate form of capital punishment, reserved for the most serious offenses such as treason and burglary, or of course, just killing another person. That'll probably do it. The execution was a public spectacle intended to deter criminal behavior within the community. Now, typically conducted at public gallows, the condemned person was dropped from a platform to ideally break the neck swiftly, though sometimes death by strangulation occurred, prolonging the suffering. That would be the worst. My long neck, I'd be screwed. That'd be 2 breaks right there. Famous individuals who met their end by hanging include Catherine Wilson, who was suspected of multiple poisonings and then later hanged in 1862, and William Palmer, the notorious Rugeley poisoner, was hanged in 1856. And everyone watched and just ate their lunch like it was UFC. They're like, oh, this is fun to watch, bring the kids, sure, why not? Over time, public executions were moved behind prison walls to quell the spectacle and growing distaste among the populace. I think if I had to pick any of these, I would do the pillory and stocks. Again, I would keep track of every neighbor who was talking shit. Once these unlocked, I'm going right for you. Throwing those mud pies at me, get lost.
Number 10, Agent Orange. The vile war in Vietnam was brutal as the spread of violence echoed throughout each neighboring village. Agent Orange is a highly toxic chemical herbicide used by the United States as part of their onslaught against the Vietnamese. According to the US, they stated it was an herbicide to specifically clear vegetation in the dense forests and jungles of Vietnam, as well as the neighboring countries like Laos and Cambodia. Due to the fact that American forces were having difficulty finding Vietnamese troops in the forest, they chose to use this highly toxic chemical that not only destroyed their ecosystem but had caused tremendous health issues in the civilians that were caught in between the line of fire. Military personnel on both ends had experienced a long range of health issues, including various skin conditions, cancers, neurological disorders, as well as women in Vietnam experienced birth defects and miscarriages, as there was a significant number of birth defects in their offspring. 2.18 million gallons of Agent Orange was used in Vietnam, and even though there had been multiple addresses of the United States' reckless decision on using toxic gases, Dow Chemical Company, who sold the herbicide to the military, denied all liability and said no danger to human health. And like all injustices, the Circuit Court Appeals dismissed the suit, and sure, some of the US veterans and their families got compensation, but still many of them have mental health issues like PTSD. As well as for the Vietnamese, the ones whose land got destroyed by the US, to this day their trees still won't grow back. Number 9, white phosphorus. Just like Agent Orange that can cause tremendous casualties, white phosphorus is prohibited as it is subjected to the international humanitarian law. It is prohibited to use white phosphorus as an incendiary weapon against civilian populations and in areas where there is a concentration of civilians. Here's why. I know it might be too graphic for our editors to put in, but as a viewer, I ask you to Google image white phosphorus burns and see why it should not be used. The issue with white phosphorus is that it makes it smoke through burning, and because they burn extremely hot, they are difficult to extinguish, which as a result we see if you look up the images why the results look like the way it does. The burning particles adhere to skin and can continue to cause damage even after the initial contact, which is why we see multiple holes burned into the skin, as white phosphorus can cause deep burns, all the way down to and even through the bone, and it can reignite even after initial treatment. So if you can imagine being dropped on this on you as a civilian and you have your family with kids, the result is tragic and inhumane. Its everlasting effects can be vile and devastating, and just like Agent Orange in Lebanon, where they got attacked with white phosphorus from the Israeli forces, who right now is still bombing Gaza with white phosphorus, the burning of the Lebanese woods and forests include more than 40,000 ancient olive trees, exacerbated the environmental impact of the conflict. Number 8, targeting hospitals. When it comes to targeting civilians of nations when a war takes place, deliberating attacks on medical facilities and personnel depriving civilians of crucial healthcare is a war crime and an extreme punishment as a result of conflict and war. Hospitals and medical personnel are protected under international humanitarian law. Targeting hospitals and medical personnel intentionally and as strategy of war is a war crime. Additional provisions of Article 19 under the Geneva Convention still allow hospitals to be protected even if it defends itself or has small arms and ammunition taken from the wounded. In 2008, Sri Lankan armed forces have launched attacks that struck hospitals. Tens of thousands of civilians have been held hostages as shields by the armed forces, and many of the Sri Lankan armed forces unlawfully forced civilians' populations along with them in retreat. When medical staff at the Valayan Madam Hospital were doing their rounds, they found themselves in the middle of an aerial attack. One aid worker noted that as they were at the hospital, they noticed drones and everyone was getting down to cover. Then a barrage of bullets came. One of the doctors who was lying next to them was killed in a shrapnel piece that hit them in the head. 4 or 5 people were killed and more than 30 were wounded in that attack. Despite these crimes that occurred in the hospitals or medical grounds, the Human Rights Watch calls all to the UN, but like as of right now, it seems like the UN does practically nothing. Number 7, starvation and denial of humanitarian aid. The people of Gaza were cut off clean water, electricity, and access to any of the coming food by the occupying Israeli government in the early of October 2023. As of right now, there is no food in Gaza, and they're resorting to drinking salt water from the sea, as well as in order to charge their phone devices to reach out to family members or to show outreach to people what's happening in Gaza, they are charging their phones with car batteries on the roadside or trying to use solar panels that they have to get power. As of right now, over 10,000 Palestinians have died at the hands of the Israeli forces, who many of casualties are children, but that doesn't include the ones who have died of starvation, dehydration, or malnutrition. Even in a documentary born on Gaza based on the onslaught that occurred in 2014, their boats were destroyed again by Israeli forces who were only allowed to fish less than 5 miles from the land. Starvation is a tactic used constantly in wars as a way to discipline or dismantle the spirits of the people they are occupying. Humanitarian aid workers unimplemented access to populations in dire needs of states that are using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare may constitute as a war crime. And according to the IIEA, the use of starvation of civilians populations as a method of warfare is prohibited by international law. Number 6, forced labor. Also known as slavery, as we know, consists of enslaving another person as property and ownership into bondage. And in history, my God, there were slaves everywhere. From ancient Greeks, who were known for taking prisoners of war as slaves and mistreating them as an aggressive degree as there were no laws to protect them, as well as ancient Egypt and in ancient Rome. And as we know with our modern history, slavery conducted in Latin America was an economic and social institution that existed before the colonial era. After the conquest of Latin America by the Spanish and Portuguese, of the nearly 12 million slaves that were shipped across the Atlantic, over 4 million enslaved Africans were brought to Latin America. As of today, according to the Walk Free map, an estimated 50 million people were living in modern slavery on a given day in 2021, and an increase of 10 million since 2016. As well as their index, 2023 has placed the US among the small group of nations, which also includes China, North Korea, and Russia. Number 5, rats. They really do love using rats back in the day, but to be honest, you'd be surprised that they use rats even as recent as 1970s in Chile and Argentina during the Dirty War using the same methods. The method, if some might know, involved trapping rats in a bottomless cage atop a victim's abdomen. Burning coals were then placed on a small tray atop the cage, heating the metal from above. Desperation to escape the heat, the rats would begin to burrow only through the soft surface that they could find, which is the victim's flesh. With sharp claws and teeth, the rats would quickly gnaw their way into the victim's bowels, causing excruciation, pain, and terror. The technique particularly came in handy when, as I mentioned before, the Dutch leaders were trying to extract information from Spanish enemies. As soon as the caged rats were placed on the prisoner's stomach, the terrified men would often give up and they would actually just expose everything else that they knew. Number 4, stoning. Stoning, or lapidation, is a form of capital punishment where a group throws stones at a person until the subject dies from a blood trauma. It has been attested as a form of punishment from grave misdeeds since ancient times. Stoning is attested in the Near East since ancient times as a form of capital punishment for grave sins. However, stoning as a practice was not geographically limited to only near the East, as it is also a significant historical record of stoning being employed in the West as well. Ancient geographers describe both the elder and younger atrocities being stoned to death in ancient Greece around the 7th century BCE. Stoning is condemned by human rights groups as a form of cruel and unusual punishment and torment as a serious violation of human rights. As of now, human rights organizations argue that many acts targeting of stoning should not be legal in the first place by allowing them interferes with people's rights to private life. Number 3, brazen bull. Throughout history, humans in general have created an enclave of many extraordinary things. One of the cruelest punishments invented in ancient Greece, this particular type of torment was just as pleasant as everything else on this list, or rather unpleasant. The brazen bull was just that of a sculpture of a bull with a fire built underneath it. The victim was placed inside and slowly roasted to death as the fire burned and the metal grew hotter and hotter. I'm pretty sure you can imagine the pain of the victims that they were in, so that the creators of the brazen bull would just enjoy it. The bull was casted hollow and was used with a fire built below, and it was designed so that it could be opened and a person would be forced inside. As I mentioned, the fire would start underneath and the person would be burnt as the smoke and steam would escape through the nose. Incense was also placed inside to counteract the smell of burning flesh, and it is said that the series of tubes inside the statue was designed to distort the screams of the victims to make it sound like an animal. Once the individual had succumbed into their charred state, apparently the people there would also use their bones and turn them into bracelets. Number 2, the rack. The rack was a torment device consisting of a rectangular frame with a roller at each end. The victim's limbs were stretched and tied to the rollers. By turning the rollers, the body would be subjected to increasing tension, causing extreme pain and potential dislocation or dismemberment of their joints. The exact origin of the rack is pretty unclear, but the earliest mention of its use was in ancient Greece. The rack was often used as a torment method to extract confession, with the execution itself coming anyway from another method. Nevertheless, victims would perish on the rack, and for those who did not, it was far more likely more painful for the persecutor to the method of actual execution. The most infamous case of the rack as used in ancient Greece was associated with Herostratus, an arsonist who was set on fire to the second temple of Artemis in Ephesus in 356 BC. Finally, number 1, crucifixion. This form of execution was mostly associated with the death of Jesus, was rather practiced in ancient Greece, but there is at least one mention in the historical text of the Greeks condemning someone to this slow and excruciating death. According to the Greek writer Herodotus in his histories, there's an account of the execution of a Persian general by the Athenians around 479 BC. The Persians had burned Athens just a year prior in 480 BC, so the harsh punishment may have reflected the intense anger of the Greeks. In any case, Herodotus wrote that they nailed him to a plank and hung him, and this, as you know, is the form of crucifixion.
Imagine living somewhere where you could literally be asked, hey, could you die over there please? Called prohibition of death laws. They've shown up through history and around the world, and some argue that not much action is taken to enforce or punish violators, but that's because it'd be kinda hard, right? Well, this is the island of Delos, considered a holy site by the ancient Greeks. You can see many of the old temples and statues that were erected in worship of the gods there. Check her out, she's a beaut, Clark. Classic architecture texture clear teal waters and dream vacay. No better place than to die. Until the 6th century BC, when a whack job tyrant named Pisistratus ordered all of his soldiers, serfs, workers, whatever, to remove every dead body from the island as they had rendered it impure. Shovels in hands, they really did remove the dead bodies one by one until they felt they were all gone. I doubt you can actually remove all the dead bodies from any piece of land, but I imagine they probably got pretty damn close. And from there it became law in the Greek kingdom that it was illegal to die on the island of Delos. I guess if you drop dead, they just like leave a fine on your body, tuck it in your belt loop maybe, all saucy like, who knows. This wasn't the only place this happened though. Check out the coastal town of Le Lavador, France. Sheesh, what is up with not being able to die in luxury? This is nice! Anyways, due to the disputes over the crowded cemeteries, ordinances to build new cemeteries, and conflicts with local environmentalists, the mayor just tossed his hands up and said, you know what? If nobody can share, nobody gets any, and passed a law forbidding residents from dying. See guys, this is why we use our words and our listening ears. For everyone who makes fun of people's height, just know the courts will favor a short king. You should never make fun of someone for something they can't control, and height is a big one. Men especially face a lot of scrutiny and rejection for it, and we're at a point where nowadays, if you're literally 5'8", people will say you're short. Gentlemen, that is not the case. So, if you've ever been called short, listen to this. According to the 18 Laws of Qin, a set of legal codes written on bamboo slips that were unearthed in the Hubei province in 1975, during the Qin dynasty of China, there was a law stipulating that men and women shorter than the height 1.52 meters do not have to bear any criminal responsibility for any crimes they committed. Apparently, this was because the household registration system, known as hukoi today, was incomplete at the time, so it was often impossible to verify a person's age. So, the government used height. The founder of the Qin dynasty himself, Qin Shi Huang, apparently only reached 1.5 meters tall, that's 5 feet, when he was 22. So he allegedly believed that his subjects could only be defined as adults once they grew taller than that. So yeah, short kings prevail. Nothing is more freaky than government-mandated furry costume. Europe really tried just about anything in the way of public shaming to air out someone's criminal history. Unlike China or Japan, which literally tattooed faces, the Ottomans who cut off hands, or even their European ancestors who chopped off noses and ears, the 17th and 18th century Europeans took a new tactic: shame masks. The uncomfortable apparel was made out of solid metal and would have been painful and super heavy when strapped tightly to your face. Naturally, it's abrasive, it's rusty, it's riddled with tetanus. But don't worry, there are lots of cool styles, like these jaunty pagan god looking dudes. As mentioned, there are these weird animal heads like medieval furry getup. This one's a rooster, and apparently, to quote, those who were, well, the other name for a rooster, swaggering and vainglorious, would be forced to wear a rooster mask for hours, even a day. Which may not sound that bad, but again, chafy, hot, heavy cast iron, the pressure of which is on your scalp and your collarbones. And apart from these terrifying masks, criminals were given humiliating badges they had to wear for, rest of their life. Next up, we got the M&M's trial by ordeals, and by M&M I mean medieval and Mesopotamia, not the M&M candy franchise out here trialing people by fire. And while I may be joking around, these trials were no joke. If you stole a bunch of crap and you were caught, they just hang you, no questions asked. But when ordeals are deemed appropriate for the crime committed, well, they weren't effing around. You were about to go through the holy test ringer, and your punishment if failed was excommunication from the church, because God clearly didn't believe in your good name. Kinda like a Mean Girls Regina George burn book. But that was just the beginning. There were 3 types of ordeals for medieval Europe: being tossed in cold water, and if you think you're innocent, float you're guilty, makes sense. Hot water ordeal requires you to pick a stone from boiling water and heal from those burns in 3 days if you want to be innocent. And finally, hot iron, because being able to carry a pound of boiling iron meant you were righteous. Did literally anyone pass that? Meanwhile, trial and ordeal in Mesopotamia allowed the gods to decide criminal accusations, in which case I hope they all learned how to float or swim young, because God came in the form of a rapid river. The law goes as follows: if anyone bring an accusation against a man, the accused go to the river and leaps in the river. If he sinks in the river, his accused shall take possession of his house. But if the river proves that the accused is not guilty and he escapes unhurt, then he who has brought the accusation shall be put to death, and the guy who jumped jumped in the river gets to take the house of the accuser, whatever. So what I'm hearing is, welcome everyone to Mesopotamia's favorite game show, Drown or Win a House, where contestants go before the court, their gods, and one rapid river to face off the ultimate test. Are they innocent or guilty? And now for a punishment I don't even want to know how they discovered, tickly lickly torture. Some names are misleading and others are quite on the nose. This is a beautiful middle ground of both. So the victims are laid out in front of a goat, their feet are covered in salt water, goats love them salt and they love sodium, so they lick and lick and lick at the sole of his foot. And fun fact for you guys who aren't out here feeling goat tongues up often or haven't eaten manish water, they're pretty much like giant cat tongues. So rough that once the skin is pruny from a couple batches of the salt water and goat spit, the abrasive tongue will literally rip layers of skin off the foot. There's been cases of this method going so far that goat licked to expose the bones. The punishment was only ever rumored to be used in medieval France, and it's only ever described in a 1502 Italian document. Stand your ground until you can't anymore. The neck tower. This torture and execution was done in two ways, either in a tall narrow tower or in a tall wooden frame box. Either way, both tower or box could open only from the bottom side. A prisoner is put inside the wooden box frame or tower with only the neck protruding. Hands and feet would be shackled inside and only a towering pile of stones would be in there to stand on. However, each day, a stone or two is removed, dropping the prisoner lower and lower and lower by inches over the days, letting them die slowly by strangulation. Battle of the sexes with this torture, it's zanzi, a form of crushing torture used to extract confessions or as a penalization for laws broken. Now may be a fun time to mention that the 5 laws of punishment I had just counted for you guys, those punishments actually only apply to men. For women, the 5 punishments are a different set and far less severe. First is grinding grain, second is the zanzi, which you're about to learn about, third punishment is beating, fourth is confinement, but also sometimes, as mentioned, she got her womb smacked about a little, and finally 5, permission to take your own life. Not them killing you or telling you to do, no. This was some like side eye, well, we're not telling you what to do, but you know what's up, ... type of thing. Anyways, the zanzi. This finger crusher was a Chinese instrument of torture consisting of small sticks strung together with cords, which was then placed around the fingers and gradually pulled, causing agonizing pain inwards. Think being tricked into playing knuckle breaker by your older brother for the first time. Under traditional Chinese law, a person could not be convicted of a crime unless they confessed. The zanzi was a legal and non-lethal torture method for forcing women to confess, and for men there was a similar and more painful jiagun ankle crusher, which uses 3-yard-long wooden planks that slowly pulled and compressed the feet in an excruciating fashion that both broke tendon and bone. Time to snatch that waist ancient China style, the waist chop. Waist chopping first appeared in the Zhou dynasty, and sadly no, it was not truly a plastic surgery alternative to get that slim thick summer look going. In reality, it's when a prisoner is tied to a table, whether lengthwise or widthwise, it doesn't matter. However, it's definitely far less comfortable to be chopped in half while also awkwardly dangling your arms and legs off of a table. Anyways, lying face down, the executioner was to try being the key word, to sever the person in half using a large fodder knife at the small of the back. These big ass knives were literally so heavy, it was more like teetering forward and letting the blade kind of slam into the person and hoping for the best. Sometimes, most times, the chopping was not limited to one blow. A story from 1734 describes Yu Hongtu, the education administrator of Henan, was sentenced to a waist chop. After being cut in two at the waist, he remained alive long enough to write the Chinese character Chen, which means cruel, 7 times with his own blood before dying. After hearing this, the young Zheng emperor abolished this form of execution. I guess maybe after learning what happened to Hongtu, the emperor felt like half the man he used to be too. Huh? Yeah? We've heard of it before, we'll hear of it again. It's Ling Chi, aka slow slicing. A regular torture and execution to reoccur in BumbleBee videos due to how far spread this torture traveled, how much it was used, and just how overall disturbing it is. Slow slicing, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, was a form of torture and execution used in China from roughly 900 CE up until the practice ended around the early 1900s. The process involved tying the condemned prisoner to a wooden frame, usually in a public public place. The flesh was then cut from the body in multiple slices in a process that was not specified in detail in Chinese law and therefore likely varied per empire or century. Generally, it consists of cuts to the arms, then the legs and chest, leading to the amputation of the limbs, followed by decapitation or a stab to the heart. If the criminal was less serious or the executioner more merciful, the first cut would be to the throat. The punishment worked on 3 levels: as a form of public humiliation, as a slow and lingering death, and as a punishment after death. To be cut into pieces meant that the body of the victim was not whole in the spiritual life after death, which is massively consequential to many Chinese people who believed reincarnation required being whole in death. It is described as a fast process lasting no longer than 15 to 20 minutes. The coup de grace was all the more certain when the family could afford a bribe to have the stab to the heart inflicted first. Some emperors ordered 3 days of cutting, while others may have ordered specific tortures before the execution for a longer execution. For example, records show that during Yan Chouhan's execution, Yan was heard shouting for half a day before his death. And finally, the 9 degrees of punishment are 10 shades of effed up. In the words of Mulan's Mushu, alright, that's it. Dishonor, dishonor on your whole family. Make a note of this. Dishonor on you, dishonor on your cow. Well, the Qin dynasty and a few others of China really felt this sentiment with their whole chests, and it shows in the creation of the 9 degrees. See, the punishment involved the execution of close and extended family members. These included the criminal's living parents, the criminal's living grandparents, any children the criminal may have over a certain age, which varied depending on the time period and who was in control and what their definition of a child even was. Also siblings and siblings-in-laws, uncles of the criminal as well as their spouses, and of course the criminal himself. Imagine messing up so bad your whole family line just gets annihilated. We all have that cousin or sibling who would have screwed all of us by now if this still happened. A famous documentation of the 9 degrees is the story of Fang, a Confucian scholar famous for his loyalty to the emperor Zhou. When the emperor is usurped and Fang is asked by the new one to write an inaugural address, well, Fang refuses. It's also ancient China, so realistically he knows exactly what refusal means, so that proves how metal his decision was. Even when threatened with family extermination, Fang showed his IDGAF attitude and is reported saying, "Never mind 9 agnates, go ahead with 10. Blowing steam out the ears, the emperor says, "Bet." And so Fang becomes perhaps the only case of extermination of 10 agnates in the history of China. So quite literally, in addition to his own execution, the blood relations from all 9 branches of his family hierarchy were killed. And as a kick to the nuts, his students and peers were added to be the 10th group. Random people unrelated to him who just happened to attend his lectures or work with the guy. Although altogether 873 people are said to have been executed. Because this guy refused to write a speech and when threatened said, "Do it bro, I dare you." Before death, Fang was forced to watch his brother's execution, and then Fang himself was executed by waist cutting. And legend goes that prior to his death, he dipped his finger in his own blood and wrote on the ground the Chinese character Quan, which means usurper. Man was petty until the end and took 873 people with him to prove it. Is the elephant. Those same guys that you watch paint at the zoo or roll around in the mud are the same hardcore MFs that used to be weapons of war in South and Southeast Asia. While elephants were no strangers to the battlefields, they were a common capital punishment method as well, called the gungoreo. As they were smart and easily trainable, they could be used to crush, dismember, or overall torment captives in very public death sentences. The earliest record of death via elephant dates back to the classical period. However, the practice was already well established by that time and continued well into the 19th century. The most common way that the execution by elephant was carried out was the obvious: crush its victim to death with brute force. But elephants were even sometimes used in a kind of trial by ordeal where the condemned prisoner is released if he manages to fend off the elephant for long enough. The Mughal Emperor Akbar the Great is said to have used this technique to chastise rebels, and then in the end, the prisoners, presumably much chastened, were given their lives. So this obviously tells you that aside from enemy soldiers, civilians who commit certain crimes could also be punished in this brutal way. These crimes included theft, tax evasion, heresy, and rebellion. During the expedition to central India in 1868, Louis Rousselet, a French writer, photographer, and traveler, described a death sentence of a criminal by elephant. The sketch was made of the event showing the condemned being forced and placing his head on a pedestal and then being held there, while the elephant foot crushed his head. Yeah. So, punishment number 9 is branding, a global classic. Who in the ancient world wasn't branded B-words for doing stuff they didn't want them to do? Now, in Euro nations, it was usually women or servant workers getting marked up, but in India, it was also a punishment for things other than being caught with your pants down, literally. See, how they like to do it was the culprit was branded with a hot iron, smack dab in the center of their forehead with the words describing the offense. If you stole eggs, they will brand "stole eggs" on your face, which is equally hilarious and embarrassing. So I guess the shame part would really actually work there, especially because this branding punishment always came with a reduction of social class too. This method was commonly used in classical societies. In India, it was practiced during the Mughal rule, and it since has been completely abolished. Punishment number 8 is pillory. This device was shared between a few nations. The Europeans loved this crap and used it on women constantly. As you may know from the BumbleBee videos, top 10 spine-chilling ways women were punished in medieval times, part 1 and 2. If you haven't seen those, maybe go check them out on our channel and subscribe to the Hive while you're at it so you don't miss out on anything else. In pillory, the offender was compelled to stand in a public place with his head and hands locked in the iron frame so that he couldn't move. Uncomfortably hunched over, the victim would then have his ears nailed to the pillory through the top cartilage, so his head is forced up on an angle, adding to the uncomfortable position of the spine. It would essentially be like this. Then finally, the victim would be whipped, branded, or stoned. However, if the victim was super hella dangerous, I don't know, maybe he was like a top soldier, turned evil, but had really good battle skills, and they had to be concerned about that, they'd use the pillory just to restrain him while they physically nailed the guy's actual body to a wall, then stoned them. This was practiced till the 19th century. Punishment number 7 is lost limbs. In other words, it means damaging a person severely, especially by removing a part of the body. It's another classic amongst the medieval societies, and like others who like to cut limbs off as punishment, it was usually the nose, ears, hand, or feet in India. Whatever the crime was determined the limb lost. During that period, one or both of the hands of a person were chopped off if the offender committed theft. If he indulged in intercourse offenses, such as violating someone, his privates were cut off. That one still happens nowadays, just usually once the prisoner is already in jail. Not done by the government. Anyways, back to it. If he told a lie or criticized God, his tongue would be cut off, and if he was deceitful or untrustworthy, his ears were cut off. Punishment number 6 is brain ablaze. So, in ancient India, it turns out another fun punishment was to have certain parts, but only parts, of your body set on fire. This punishment came in alongside the upheavals of ancient Indian political history, wherein kings and dynasties faced endless threats and challenges from rivals. Enough so that, like all kingdoms, violence against the king became a serious political problem that had to be dealt with ruthlessly and effectively through preemptive action, punishment, and retaliation. The punishment for one who reviles, spreads evil news about the king, or reveals council secrets is punished with tearing out the tongue, as aforementioned. More severe crimes against the king and kingdom, however, invite more severe punishments. Death by setting fire to the hands and head is a punishment for one who covets the kingdom, forces entry into the king's harem, attacks the king's palace, aids his enemies, incites forced people or enemies, or causes a rebellion in a fortified city, countryside, or army. The man is restrained, his head and hands doused in sulfur or another flammable, and lit ablaze.
Number 5, rotisserie. My bad, I had to think of a title for this one, but I know it's pretty grim. Impalement was used as a form of torment and execution in which a person is pierced with a long stake. This method would lead to a slow, painful death, and often the victim was hoisted into the air after partially impaled. Gravity and the victim's own struggles would cause him to slide down the pole, and death could take many days. Impalement was precise in the European times throughout the Middle Ages. Vlad III the Dracula, as we know, who learned this method by killing by impalement while staying in Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, as a prisoner, and Ivan the Terrible have passed into legend as major users of this method. His method of torment was a horse attached to each of the victim's leg as a sharpened stake was gradually forced into the body. Death by impalement was slow and agonizing, as victims sometimes endured for hours or even days. Vlad often had stakes arranged in various geometric patterns as well, so in some way he had a dream and a vision like an IKEA catalog magazine. So like, here's my barbecue, my outdoor swimming pool, and my impaled prisoners in the shape of a star. Number 4, OG lipo. Pretty straightforward type of torment, although just as disgusting or disgusting. Intestinal crank was a method of torment, or rather a capital punishment, involving making an incision in the abdominal area, separating the duodenum from the pylorus, and attaching of the upper part of the intestine to a crank. The crank would then be rotated to extract the intestines from the gastrointestinal cavities of the conscious person. The outcome was always death, but not immediate, so they would be watching their guts coming out. Number 3, don't sleep. The heretic's fork was a torment device consisting of a long, length metal with 2 opposing bi-pronged forks as well as an attached belt or strap. The device was placed between the breastbone and the throat just under the chin and secured with a leather strap around the neck. Although the victim was hung from the ceiling or otherwise suspended in a way so that they couldn't lie down, a person wearing it couldn't fall asleep. The moment that their head would drop with a little bit of fatigue, the prongs would pierce their throat or their chest, causing extreme great pain. This very simple instrument created long periods of sleep deprivation, and people were awake for days, which made confessions a bit more easier for those giving the punishment. Number 2, the festin. Unsure where this was originally originated, but it was actually used at least far back as 60 CE in the Roman Empire. Emperor Nero also used this method of torment as a tool of justice against his enemies, and if we know Nero, he was all sure a fan of torment. Those awaiting punishment were placed in loose pants that were tied tightly around the ankles, and rats were then poured into the pants where they were scratched and bit the prisoners' legs and groins while they were trying to escape the fabric. One of the most fiendish forms of rat torture emerged when the Dutch revolt in 16th and 17th century. The method involved trapping rats in a bottomless cage atop a victim's abdomen or their chest. Burning coals were then placed on top of this tray atop the cage, heating the metal from above. Desperate to escape the heat, the rats would then begin to burrow the only way out, which is the person's stomach or their chest. With sharp claws and teeth, the rats will quickly gnaw their way into the victim's bowels, causing excruciating pain and terror. The technique was particularly came in handy when Dutch leaders were trying to extract information from their Spanish enemies. As soon as the caged rats were placed on a prisoner's abdomen, the terrified men would just give up and tell them everything before the coals were added on top. And finally, number 1, cooked. Although it's noted that the most famous form of torment and method of getting rid of a witch was to burn her or put them in the stake, but this was more common in Europe during the early 1300s and then at the end of the 17th century. In the Middle Ages, burning was used as both a form of torment as well as a capital punishment. As a form of torment, the victim's feet would be held to a fire or trapped into metal boots that were heated up, or they could be strapped into an iron chair that was lit on fire underneath, or red hot irons that could be applied. Metal torments instruments were also often heated, pincers, pliers, and so on. Burning or molten liquids could also be used. The victim would also be forced to dip limbs in them or even have them poured down their throats as a form of capital punishment. Burning has always had a long history for crimes as treason for heresy, blasphemy, and witchcraft, being regarded by the Christian churches as treason against God. Sodomy was also punished by burning alive, again because it was seen as a crime against God.